Last week, Brian kicked off this new series called Practices as we continue our journey in the Sermon on the Mount. And some of you may say, man, we're still in the Sermon on the Mount? Yep, and I'm loving every bit of it. I love it. He shared some really good news last week that I think we need again today, and I want us to start here. He said, we live in the story that best helps us make sense of the world. When we choose to inhabit the story of God's people that's been unfolding for thousands of years, we get to, everybody say we get to live as the much-loved children of God. And our spiritual practices help us become the person the story tells us we are. Man, that's important. It's good news. And what is so important about it, the story that tells us who we are. Who we listen to about who we are matters. It's why it's so important that our view of God, how we see him, matters. How we see us and how we see him in his story matters. So for the next few weeks, what we're going to do, we're going to look at the first few verses of Jesus, what he speaks in Matthew 6, and we're going to talk about spiritual practices and how they help us become. So this is a tricky subject sometimes because we're not talking about a checklist of things that we should be doing. And we say around here, don't should on yourself. I'm not good at saying that, so I have to enunciate it really well. Don't should on yourself, which means don't beat yourself up. Don't let guilt and shame be the thing that creeps in about all the things that you should be doing, because we know that Christ doesn't operate with guilt and shame. That's not what he does. Practices are not about looking good, so that other people will look at you and be like, man, look how religious that guy is. Look how good he is. Jesus actually says something, these first 4 verses of Matthew 6, he says, be careful that you don't practice your religion in front of people to draw their attention. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Whenever you give to the poor, don't blow your trumpet, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so they may get praise from people. I assure you, that's the only reward they'll get. But when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that you may give to the poor in secret. And your Father who sees what you do in secret will reward you. Good news. We're going to unpack some more of that today about these practices. I think I've shared with you guys in the past, we have a used hot tub, and that's a lot of fun for our family. We had no idea whenever we bought that hot tub how important it would be for our boys, and we just hang out in the hot tub. They love it. They would hang out there for hours. Sometimes we do. And we just sit and we talk. Sometimes they want the jets off, and they just want to talk, and we tell stories, and we're more connected to each other, like we're more present to each other. So we love our hot tub time, but like I said, we bought it used, and last year it sprung a leak, and we can't find the leak. So I've searched. Many of you will probably come up. Have you checked this? I've checked it all, okay? So don't waste my time this morning. I don't have time to talk about that. Just kidding. We looked everywhere for the hot tub and the leak. But what happens is we can't find it. Sometimes it leaks, sometimes it doesn't. So all of a sudden we'll go out there and it's this much lower than what it should be. So if I have water going out, guess what I have to do? Put water in, right? So the other day I'm down there and I turn on the hose, and this happens so frequently because my wife uses the hose also, and I think she's the one responsible for this, by the way. And the kids use the hose, but I use the hose for washing the hot tub and filling it back up. And the other day, I turn on the hose, and I'm holding the hose, and guess what happens? No water. Why? Because it's got 17 kinks in it that she put in it. I know she did. So then you had to go back, and you got to unkink the hose, and unkink the hose, and unkink the hose, until finally all the hose is unkinked, and guess what happens? Water can flow out of it, right? Yeah. Well, here's the good news I want to share with you today. Spiritual practices are not just the homework of the Christian life. They free the Spirit's transforming power to flow through us into the world. That is good news. I hope that's good news to you. And I think off the top we think that is good news, but how does that work actually? What does that look like? Well, we look to Jesus for our example. of what that looks like. And in the Sermon on the Mount, that's what he's actually doing. He's describing what life actually looks like, connected to him, connected to the Father, connected to the Spirit, in the kingdom. That this is what it looks like to become human again. This is what it looks like to live the life he's calling us into. And then he followed it up with his life. So he told us, then he showed us, right? Now again, the problem with this when we start thinking about this is we start thinking, what do we need to do? How do I do that necessarily? So practices are not a to-do list. Everybody say practices are not a to-do list. We got to get that out of the way first and foremost. Spiritual practices are not just the homework of the Christian life. They free the Spirit. It's transforming power to flow through us into the world. So let's look at the life of Jesus and name some things that I think might help us figure out why? What does that look like? How does that work? And first, I want to remind you that Jesus was fully human. We've talked about this several months before. It said, though he was in the form of God, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit. But he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and by becoming like humans. And when he found himself in the form of a human, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. It said Jesus emptied himself of his divine power. He embraced our human limitations. He became one of us. Jesus was tempted. Jesus was hurt. Jesus spent time with people. Jesus was hungry and he ate. He was thirsty, so he drank. Jesus used the restroom just like the rest of us. Maybe that'd be a good thing for you. Next time you use the restroom, Jesus did this. He was human, fully human. He was born into this world with us, to be one of us, for us, even to the death. So as we look at Jesus' life and as we see him moving around, he's not walking around with some superhero powers from a camel bite or anything like that. In fact, Jesus did nothing by his own power. Nothing. And in John chapter 5, he responded to the Jewish leaders and he said, I assure you that the Son can't do anything by himself except for what he sees the Father doing. Whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. So not only did he do nothing by himself and access the power of the Father, but he actually showed up and did something really important, which is show all of us what God really looks like. So we really see the story more clearly because of Jesus. It's why when he showed up and he's teaching the Sermon on the Mount, all of these people were having a hard time trying to figure it out. But as they begin to listen to Jesus and watch Jesus' life, they see more clearly who the Father actually is. Turns out, he's just like Jesus. I love the words of N.T. Wright. He says, if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. If you want to know what it's like to be human, look at Jesus. Isn't that good? Here we stand. We believe this is who we are in Christ's image. And we say, who is God really? Look at Jesus. What does that mean for me? How am I supposed to live this human life? Look at Jesus. That's why we talk about following Jesus so frequently around here, because it's our view of who God is, it's our view of who we are, and it's our view of how we actually live this life out in his kingdom. So when it comes to becoming human again, Jesus is describing what it looks like through his whole sermon, and then he lives it out. He was always about the Father's business. He was always in connection with God. He received his power from God, and God was present to the people through Jesus. You might say it like this: Jesus was God's presence, channeling the Spirit's power into the world. And we saw some spiritual practices of Jesus. We saw him go away in solitude. He actually started his ministry in solitude before he was taken by the Romans. He was actually in solitude. He'd often go off and pray. He would rest. He would go to the synagogues. He would proclaim good news all the time. He was always surrendering to the love of the Father. There was a time, I was thinking about this right in the sermon, there was a time where a young boy was brought to Jesus by his father, and he said, hey, all your disciples can't cast out this demon. So Jesus cast out the demon, and the disciples in secret came and said, how'd you do that? He said, well, this one comes out in prayer. He's reminding them, you're trying to do this on your own. We don't do it on our own. I don't do it on my own. Jesus did nothing by his own power, which means we do nothing by our own power, right? And this is a hard one for me. I was talking to my counselor about this week. He's like, do you ever just stand on your back deck and look up at the stars and remember, if he's got you, you got him, and if this thing goes together and you're not responsible for all this? I'm like, yeah, it's a good reminder. I'm actually preaching on that this weekend. Thank you. We do nothing by our own power. Jesus said, remain in me, and I will remain in you. A branch can't produce fruit by itself, but must remain in the vine. And likewise, you can't produce fruit unless you remain in me. I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me, I in you, and then you will produce much fruit. Without me, you can't do anything. And Jesus modeled that for us. I do nothing on my own. It's the Father that does it through me. We do nothing on our own. Spiritual practices aren't just homework of the Christian life, things that we have to do to be good Christians. They transform us. They free the Spirit's transforming power to in us, to transform us, to flow and transform the world. And it's not on us. Isn't that good news? Before Jesus went away, he said that he would send the same Spirit, the Spirit that lived in him and on him, and that's how we would remain in Jesus. So he said, I'll ask the Father, and he will send another companion who'll be with you forever. The companion is the Spirit of truth, whom the world can't receive because it neither sees nor recognizes him. But you know him because he lives with you and will be with you every day, every moment, every time. So now we have the Spirit. He's with us in these moments. The Spirit is God's source of power and presence in us. That's good news. So Jesus doesn't do it on his own. We don't do it on our own. And we're not even expected to, because we have a Spirit that lives in us that is doing the transforming work in us and through us to the world. This is the goal of the faith, is to live in unity with God through his Spirit. We learn from Jesus how to love like Jesus, and how to live of Jesus as if Jesus were me, because he is in me. And if I allow him to do the work in me, he will do a work through me into this world. This is good news. This is good news first, listen, because it's for you. Everybody say, it's for me. It's for me. It is for me. That's really, really good news. It allows us to be able to see others like Jesus sees. It allows us to know what he's up to and the work that he's doing. If we're to follow him, we have to be able to know what he's up to and what he's doing. This is much better than homework. This is much better than a checklist. This is us being connected to God. This is Christ in us. And this doesn't happen by doctrine and deeds, by knowing more things and doing better things, our works. Really important stuff, but it's not the point. I love this quote from Dallas Willard. Listen to this. Spiritual formation in the tradition of Jesus Christ is the process of transformation of the innermost dimensions of the human being, the heart, which is the same as the spirit or will. And it's being formed, really transformed in such a way that its natural expression comes to be the deeds of Christ done in the power of Christ. It's about becoming human again as Christ designs. Have you ever found yourself in response to somebody or doing something in a way that you step back and you're kind of like, wow, I wouldn't have normally done that? When I see that, I think that's Christ's work in me, doing good in me. Because I'm not just choosing to go do it because it's the good thing to do. It's actually out of response to the good things that God's doing in me. And then I get to step back in a little bit of awe of like, wow, that's really cool. When I just choose to go do something, a lot of times I feel good about myself doing it. When I do good in response to what God's doing in me, I stand in awe of what God is doing in me. This is a result of the work of the Spirit in our life. Not you working in the world. It's how his work overflows to the world. So it's good news because it's for me. Say that. It's for me. And it's for everyone else. Right? It's for me, not to stop with me, but to be for everyone else. And if the hose has got a kink in it, guess what can't happen? It cannot flow through you into the world, transforming you, transforming the world. This is God's love and grace and goodness and hope expressed through you. That's good. Through you. Now, what I'm noticing in my life is when I'm impatient with my family, never with Heather, when I get frustrated, when I lose my temper, when I find my mind judging other people or putting myself above someone else, I'm noticing that the hose is kinked in my life. One of the practices that we champion around here that's really important in my life is practicing grace and truth. That I get to embody grace and truth in my relationships, which means in my relationships, when that's happening, I'm empowering other people, not overpowering them. Not like, boys, go do what I said because I'm your father. But when I'm empowering them, not overpowering them. When I'm including others. When I'm pulling somebody in and calling them into something good and helping them see something else, I'm embodying grace and truth in my relationships. And when that's happening, the hose is unkinked. I see that. That practice in my life is helping that flow through me to other people. And when all of a sudden I feel myself overpowering somebody, or when I feel myself checking out and just saying, I don't care about anybody today. I'm just going to go by myself. And I'm withholding power from somebody else. I'm not letting Christ do work in me. Those are kinks that are happening. And then when I'm embodying grace and truth, it's opening the kink so that the Spirit flows through me, transforms me on the way out to the world. It's such good news. Because early on, I felt so much pressure to perform and be, and that it was on me. And so often, as one of the pastors around here, I feel so much pressure and responsibility that it's on me or on us of what this church does or how you grow or whatever that looks like. And I know that I don't do this on my own. It's His power in me, His strength in me that flows into the world. First, it's for you, and then it's for everybody else. So your life, do you notice kinks in the hose? Like, do you notice those moments where you're like, oh my gosh, I think the hot tub's empty and it needs to be filled up again. I think my hose has a kink in it. What do you do about that? I think a good thing to do today would first be surrender to the fact that we don't do it on our own. You're not responsible necessarily for how that works. Your responsibility is to surrender to His goodness, let Him do the work in your life, and to build in practices that allow Him to flow in you and through you. It's His power and presence in us that can help transform the world, right? Maybe let's just start with that. Let's just close our eyes and pray for a moment. And the thing I want you to do is if this is resonating with you, maybe the first step is just the thing that I have to do so often is just surrender to the fact that it's His power and presence in me that transforms the world. That I don't do this on my own. And maybe just take a moment to have a conversation with Him, to sit with Him, to be present to this good news for a moment, and I'll close this in prayer. Father, thank you for your constant work in us. Help us to be more aware and awake Help us to see this life not about check boxes, but about communion with you, allowing your Spirit to be present in us and living life with us. God, thank you for that today. I ask this in your name. Amen. I want to close with this quote from Walter Brueggemann. And I want you to listen to this. The importance, the things that kind of hang in the balance, I think, for us sometimes as followers of Jesus, as a church. He says, we all have a hunger for certitude. We want to be right. And the problem is that the gospel is not about certitude, but it's about fidelity. It's about relationship. So what we all want to do is if we can, is immediately transpose fidelity into certitude. So God starts this whole thing with relationship. And what we want to do is turn it around to certitude instead of fidelity. Because fidelity is a relational category and certitude is flat, mechanical category. So we have to acknowledge our thirst for certitude and then recognize that if you had all the certitude in the world, it would not make the quality of your life any better, because what we must have is fidelity. In other words, we tend to settle for right answers, and we stop there. And Jesus settles for nothing less than a relationship. Isn't that good? We want to be right. We want to know what to do, what boxes to check, and to be right. And as a community of believers, we want to be able to know what's right versus lean in to the fidelity, the relationship of Christ. That's important as we walk out here today. Okay? All right.